The topic of tradwives, or traditional wives, who adhere to the gender roles of husbands being breadwinners and women being domestics, has gained immense popularity lately, both online and in mainstream discourse. In a world where you have the unprecedented choice to either not have kids or control how many, be a dual-income household, ship your kids off to boarding school, or be part of an unemployed communist polycule so long as you can afford to do so, it may seem strange on the surface that being a stay-at-home mom of all family dynamics is suddenly controversial, when it has been the American ideal for quite some time. The discourse around tradwives in our current political moment, however, represents the perfect manifestation of rising tensions in feminist versus anti-feminist beliefs, neoliberal versus protectionist economics, and the increasing conservative-progressive divide we see both online and in real life. In this video, I'll show how in a time period where it is becoming increasingly difficult for people to support a family on one income, women are turning against the promises of second-wave and neoliberal feminism and looking towards domesticity and interpersonal relationships for fulfillment outside the market economy, as well as explore the historical conditions that make this possible. But before I get into the neoliberal feminist versus anti-capitalist tradwife dichotomy in this video, I do want to mention that modern-day feminism, as well as the anti-feminist choice to be a tradwife, are both privileges that emerged as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and so I want to give kind of a brief history on that so we can understand better where we are today. How technology advanced feminism. When industrialization began in Europe in the 18th century, and later in the United States among other countries, home life shifted dramatically from the agrarian economy that preceded it. As manufacturing shifted from the home to the factories, men went to the city to make income, and lower-class women took up paid domestic roles, or worked alongside children in the textile industry for 16-hour days, which is still the case in developing countries today. Increased agricultural productivity allowed for a rising population as large-scale mechanized agriculture began to overtake subsistence farming. And while the agricultural age called for birthing more children to assist with farming, in the industrial age, having more children often resulted in more work for the mother. It's also important to note that women were paid much less than men at this point in time, and so if a couple could afford for one person to stay home, it makes sense for it to be the woman, especially because it's just physically harder to work while you're pregnant, and most of these jobs are physical jobs which are better performed by men. By the Second Industrial Revolution, however, the writing was pretty much on the wall for anyone who chose to see it, that gender roles were going to be shifting dramatically due to increased automation of domestic processes, therefore freeing up more of women's time. And in 1890, Elizabeth Cady Stanton actually testified to Congress for women's suffrage, noting the shifting gender roles that technology was allowing for. She stated, "Is it then consistent to hold the developed woman of this day within the same narrow political limits as the dame with the spinning wheel and the knitting needle occupied in the past? No, no. Machinery has taken the labors of woman, as well as man, on its tireless shoulders. The loom, the spinning wheel, are all but dreams of the past. The pen, the brush, the easel, the chisel have taken their places, while the hopes and ambitions of women are essentially changed." And later, in 1912, Thomas Edison stated in Good Housekeeping that "The housewife of the future will neither be a slave to servants nor herself a drudge. She will give less attention to the home because the home will need less. She'll be rather a domestic engineer than a domestic laborer, with the greatest of all handmaidens, electricity, at her service. This and other mechanical forces will so revolutionize the women's world that a large portion of the aggregate of a woman's energy will be conserved for use in broader, more constructive fields." And while in 1900, women spent an average of 60 hours a week on laundry, meal prep, and cleaning, by 2014 that number was 23 hours per week for stay-at-home moms and 14 hours per week for working mothers. But when it comes to the term traditional wife, most people are talking about the tradition of the 1950s, not agrarian societies where women toil in the fields and at home all day, raising 9 kids, half of whom die before adulthood. There is no traditional family setup since the dawn of history, because tradition obviously is gradually changing over time, but it does make sense why people look back on the 1950s housewife as their idealized image. Reason being that the 1950s in the United States was a time where being a stay-at-home mom was probably the most accessible to people outside the richer classes than it had ever been, because of the economic prosperity that followed World War II. While women were pulled into the workforce while their husbands fought, upon men's return, most women returned to the home, both from social pressures as well as it being more of an option again. This was a time of mass consumerism and a large baby boom, which caused motherhood to be more front and center in society, as there were more children to look after and more shiny new appliances to buy and be marketed. This is kind of the ideal time to be a homemaker, and it's no wonder that it's what is aestheticized in social media. Most of the backbreaking domestic work of the past had been automated, and homemakers were looked upon favorably by society. And then, of course, the next technological breakthrough that altered women's life and gender role in society probably more than anything else ever has came out, and that was the birth control pill in 1960. And then, of course, that pill led into the sexual revolution, which changed a lot of cultural and social norms. And then with Roe v. Wade in the 1970s, abortion became a lot more accessible. You didn't have to stick a coat hanger up and scramble your own egg. It was a little bit less dangerous, and therefore people felt a little bit more comfortable having a lot of sex. Back in the day, whether or not you like kids or want to be a mother, if you like to fuck, you're probably going to end up pregnant eventually, whereas now you can fuck as much as you want and never get pregnant. And the consequences of this cannot be overstated. And that's also why we see a reactionary pushback on things like abortion and birth control coming from the conservative right, which I'll get into later on in this video. But with motherhood suddenly becoming a choice, and most jobs no longer requiring heavy physical labor more fit for men, second-wave feminism came about advocating for the economic equality between the sexes and a push for women to enter the workforce. Not because they had to, but for personal fulfillment and as an extension of their individual identities separate from their family units. And Betty Friedan, in The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, famously argued that women could not find fulfillment in the home. And by the 1980s, the second-wave feminist push for women in the corporate workforce was propitiously complemented by our wide-scale shift into neoliberal economics, which leads us into our next section, neoliberal capitalism and girl boss feminism. In this section, I'll explain how modern-day feminism is the confluence of neoliberal economics and second-wave gender politics, as well as how us nearing the end of our faith in this era is really adding fuel to the fire of the tradwife versus feminist debate. And to briefly explain what neoliberalism is, it's basically free market capitalism that supports the deregulation of various industries and globalization of the market. It most notably came to prominence in the 1980s alongside the political leaderships of Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, and has been the backdrop of our economic system and ethos ever since, albeit imperfectly. As technological and social progress from the 1960s onward paved way to an individualistic model for women that separated them from their husband's finances and the traditional responsibilities of the nuclear family, neoliberalism emphasized an individualistic view of finance more widely as it shrank the welfare state and focused on the rational economic choices of individual actors. One consequence of neoliberalism and the dual income family structure has been the increase in people hiring nannies in the informal market, and in 1993, there was a brief scandal referred to as Nannygate, when two of Bill Clinton's choices for U.S. Attorney General were withdrawn from consideration after news broke out that they had hired illegal immigrants as nannies and paid them under the table. Something that outside of politics seemed like no big deal both at that time and today, as only 6% of nannies are hired legally in the United States, whether immigrants or not. To read from a New York Times article that was published right after the scandal in 1993, it states, "In the 1980s, as more American women with young children moved into the workplace, the demand for housekeepers increased exponentially, satisfied by greater numbers of West Indians and Latin Americans and by new illegal migration from the Philippines, China, Ireland, and Poland. Despite the controversy, a woman in Floral Park, Queens, said she was specifically looking to hire a newly arrived illegal immigrant to care for her newborn triplets. I want someone who cannot leave the country, who doesn't know anyone in New York, who basically does not have a life," the woman said. "I want someone who is completely dependent on me and loyal to my family." If your politics are to decrease government regulation, lower taxes, and increase GDP by any means necessary, it makes sense to have illegal immigrants come in who don't pay taxes and can't access the welfare state, to do labor for the bare minimum while American citizens get higher paying jobs in services that boost the GDP a lot more than being a nanny. Increased immigration and the offshoring of labor, however, will greatly increase the divide we see on both the left and the right to the established neoliberal order, as both sides start to argue for protectionist economic policies. But before I get into how all of that arose after the 2008 financial crisis, I do want to cite kind of the perfect manifesto of neoliberal feminism, which is Linda Hirschman's 2006 book, Get to Work, A Manifesto for Women of the World, as a perfect love child between free market capitalism and second-wave careerist feminist values. This manifesto is also where we get the term choice feminism, which is kind of the central core of the tradwife versus feminism debate. It's also been a major theme in third and fourth wave feminism, with some saying that any choice a woman makes so long as she's free to do so is feminist, whereas others say no, feminists have to act within certain moral rules and confines in order to be valid. Belinda Hirschman defines choice feminism, saying, "Choice feminism, the shadowy remnant of the original movement, tells women that their choices, everyone's choices, the incredibly constrained choices they made, are good choices. Everyone says if feminism failed it was because it was too radical, but we know, and surely the real radical Betty Friedan knew, that it wasn't because feminism was too radical, it was because feminism was not radical enough. A movement that stands for everything ultimately stands for nothing." This forms her basis for deeming women who choose to be stay-at-home moms or work flexible part-time hours while raising children to be immoral and anti-feminist, saying, "Founding home is not good for women and it's not good for society. They aren't using their capacities fully. Their so-called free choice makes them unfree dependents on their husbands. Whether they leave the workplace altogether or just cut back their commitment, their talent and education are lost from the public world to the private world of laundry and kissing boo-boos." And later on, "Every time a woman quits, she reduces her human capital for some future venture into the labor market. There is almost no payoff in the market economy to spend years biking and singing and listening to NPR," something she criticizes a stay-at-home mom for doing, saying, "Isn't that too much inner child for an adult woman?" And to me, this is a totally neoliberal market approach to feminism. It's only for high-powered women who can afford daycare and nannies and the like, and can split the rest of domestic work 50-50 with their husbands. She's also notably only concerned with the upper echelon of Ivy League graduates when it comes to condemning stay-at-home mothers. But this is a worldview that is solely focused on money and increasing women's value via GDP, rather than interpersonal relationships and motherhood and the like. The girl boss feminist ethos behind this mentality would lie dormant for a few years, however, in response to the 2008 financial crisis that rocked the world and greatly disaffected the American public from the promise of endless economic growth, as their government hypocritically abandoned free market values to bail out institutions deemed too big to fail, while the rest of us lost our jobs and our houses. The government decided it would socialize losses and privatize profits. The Great Recession also highlighted the rise of income inequality that had gone on through the neoliberal era, as people saw the rich bounce back and gain wealth much faster than everyone else following the crash. This frustration towards privatization and corporate greed was probably most visually discernible with the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, but has continued to grow and shapeshift ever since. But before we get into the populist campaigns of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in 2016, we see neoliberal feminism rear its corporate head once again as it returns from maternity leave, and that is in the 2013 girl boss movement. The ethos of girl boss feminism kicked off with the publications of former Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg's book Lean In, and fast fashion business mogul Sophia Amoruso's #girlboss, alongside an increase of the feminist label being used throughout popular culture, from Beyoncé's performances to tacky clothing and mugs to the proliferation of women-owned online shops and single-sex co-working spaces. And the girl boss ideal is basically exactly what it sounds like, encouraging women to enter high-powered positions, even if it means outsourcing labor to places with poor working conditions or paying their employees the bare minimum, because women's worth in society, according to feminism, is to make the same amount of money as a man and do the same things that men do, and just basically act like high-powered men. And in 2013, there was actually an article published in The Guardian that was highly critical of this movement right off the bat, that also reflects the public's growing distrust in neoliberalism at the time, titled "How Feminism Became Capitalism's Handmaiden," stating, "One contribution was our critique of the family wage, the ideal of a male breadwinner, female homemaker family that was central to state-organized capitalism. Feminist criticism of that ideal now serves to legitimate flexible capitalism. After all, this form of capitalism relies heavily on women's waged labor, especially low-waged work in service and manufacturing, performed not only by young single women, but also by married women and women with children. Not by only racialized women, but by women of virtually all nationalities and ethnicities. As women have poured into labor markets around the globe, state-organized capitalism's ideal of the family wage is being replaced by the newer, more modern norm, apparently sanctioned by feminism, of the two-earner family. Never mind that the reality that underlies the new ideal is depressed wage levels, decreased job security, declining living standards, a steep rise in the number of hours worked for wages per household, exacerbation of the double shift, now often a triple or quadruple shift, and a rise in poverty increasingly concentrated in female-headed households. Neoliberalism turns a sow's ear into a silk purse by elaborating a narrative of female empowerment. Invoking the feminist critique of the family wage to justify exploitation, it harnesses the dream of women's emancipation to the engine of capital accumulation." And a lot of these arguments were explored in Elizabeth Warren's Dual Income Trap, published in 2004, which just goes to show that the tensions between careerist feminism and male breadwinner, female homemaker dynamics has been brewing for decades, the tension between the two. Girl boss feminism as a pop culture moment, though, started to fade out in 2016 with the rise of populism on the left and the right, and alongside the loss of Hillary Clinton, who was the physical embodiment of neoliberal girlboss-ery into one person, pantsuit and all. And as feminism shifted into intersectionality and anti-capitalism, we saw the fall of girl boss empires as owners were called out for microaggressions and unfair, though legal, work practices. And in 2018, even Michelle Obama spoke out about the message of lean in being ludicrous, which is how you know it was totally over for that campaign. Feminism aside, however, we see how significantly antipathy towards the current economic order got in that crucial 2016 election, as both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump ran on protectionist economic policies, with Sanders advocating for things like universal health care, student loan bailouts, and raising the minimum wage, and Trump focusing on things like stricter immigration law, returning manufacturing to American soil, and higher tariffs. And to end this section with a quote of how our current ideological grab bag in society is a result of lack of faith in neoliberal institutions, the New Republic states in Is the Neoliberal Era Over Yet? That the disparity between what neoliberalism promised and what it delivered led more or less directly to the rise of movements from Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and Democratic Socialists of America to Trumpism. Despite the ideological grab bag these movements represent, all fundamentally rejected neoliberalism in one or more ways. Progressive or left groups rejected the failed promises that free markets would create a tide that lifted all boats and foster innovations that solve problems like crime, poverty, and climate change, while the right increasingly rejected the core neoliberal ideas of globalization, internationalism, and cosmopolitan social attitudes in favor of insular, nationalist, and traditional views. And upon the election of Joe Biden, that the Democrats, unwilling to commit to abandoning the neoliberal order that it believes remains appealing to the moderate center, are stumbling forward as the bag holders for a failed and broadly discredited political worldview. Imagine, if you can, the Republican Party emerging from the wreckage of the New Deal, defending Roosevelt's worldview, rather than forcefully arguing for an alternative to replace it. That is, unbelievably, our current political moment. And in a similar vein to politicians needing to offer alternatives to the neoliberal order, the mainstream feminist left needs to grapple with the fact that men and women generally have different roles and interests, and that we have to find a functional model that supports motherhood without forcing a regression back into an age in which women don't have the same rights as men. With that being said, let's take a look at both apolitical and conservative tradwives, as well as the many arguments that feminists lob against them. Enter the tradwives. Part 1. Apolitical and liberal tradwives and their opposition. So the liberal and apolitical tradwives are typically choice feminists by default, meaning they don't view staying home as an affront to gender equality. They support women's right to work if they want, or to enter non-traditional relationships, or to not have children. It's basically a live and let live philosophy, and is kind of the umbrella that most stay-at-home moms or tradwives fall under. And being a stay-at-home mom is compatible with neoliberal economics, even though, of course, it is becoming less and less attainable for most people. It just reduces the private sphere into the home, so as long as you can afford to subsist a family on your husband's income, it's well within your right to be a tradwife. But the risks of being a stay-at-home mom within a neoliberal structure is brought up often when it comes to criticizing the movement, namely that in the event of death or divorce, there is a weakened welfare state to help support your family, and you'll likely have a large gap on your resume and fewer employable skills, meaning you will have less earning potential upon re-entering the market. Instead of financially relying on an employer, stay-at-home moms rely on their husbands and split the husband's wages, which is apparently not what feminists meant when they demanded equal pay. And in terms of actually useful advice that gets brought up in the tradwife discourse, I do think it's generally a good idea to write a prenup before marriage, particularly if you plan on having children, to contribute to your own retirement with some of your husband's wages, as well as to have and gain a skill or an education in something that is employable in the market, just in case shit hits the fan. You should also keep in mind that it will become exponentially more difficult to leave a relationship when you financially depend on someone if that relationship turns abusive, simply because you do have less options and it's a greater financial risk. You can rely on idealized fantasies of what life should look like when it comes to making your choices, but at the end of the day, when conflict arises, you kind of have to live in the real world. But of course, every decision we make comes with risks. If you become a stay-at-home mom, you risk becoming less employable if you ever need to. But if you're a career woman, you might regret not spending more time with your children during their formative years. You really can't have everything. But moving on from the good faith criticisms, as we've seen from the Get to Work manifesto, even apolitical stay-at-home moms are not immune from feminist fire, since the personal is political and we do still hold very capitalist ideas of gender equality. I find it interesting that around 2020 there was a strong anti-work and anti-hustle culture movement, mainly associated with the left, seen through trends like the I do not dream of labor and later on quiet quitting, the presidential campaign of Andrew Yang running on the idea of universal basic income, with the idea being that AI and automation may take all of our jobs, but at least you get a little bit of money back from the government. Sanders once again running for president, and lockdowns causing mass unemployment and a shift to online work. But even with this social and political backdrop, 2020 is also when the rise of the TRADWIFE hashtag kind of gained prominence, and it was met with a lot of disdain from the left, even though that lifestyle kind of goes in line with the anti-capitalistic ideals of slow living, circular economies, for instance when it comes to hand-me-down clothes and toys, cooking from home rather than getting DoorDash or fast food, which is much better for the environment, and generally prioritizing interpersonal relationships over raising the country's GDP. And while stay-at-home moms naturally spend more time on cleaning and childcare than their working mother counterparts, they also enjoy greater leisure time and sleep, which contributes to a more idealistic work-life balance, which was a huge talking point during the lockdowns. But while progressive movements often paint themselves as anti-capitalist, in our present age of identity politics over everything, they are even more so against perceived patriarchy, both in intimate relations and in governmental systems, and view traditional gender roles as a form of oppression by the dominant male class onto the subjugated female class, rather than as a way that natural distinctions between the sexes display themselves in environments that allow for it. On the left, disdain for perceived patriarchy has taken precedence over disdain for neoliberalism, and feminists simply cannot get past the idea or the fact that tradwives depend on a man, their husbands. This contradicts Sheryl Sandberg's idea that a truly equal world would be one where women run half our countries and companies, and men run half of our homes. And while your typical stay-at-home mom may receive some disdain and criticism, and honestly envy, from feminists, it's really conservative tradwives who get the bulk of feminist ire, and that is because they're more explicitly anti-progressive and anti-feminist. And so with that, let's talk about conservative tradwives. So as within any ideology or movement, individuals vary in their beliefs, but it's the shared collective beliefs that are reflective of a community that kind of constitutes what that community is identified as. Generalizations can be useful, who knew? And so obviously not all conservative tradwives think the same things as for any other group or movement, but generally speaking, conservative tradwives are generally against immigration, are anti-abortion, are often religious, and view motherhood and being submissive to their husbands as their ultimate goal, either as a personal choice or as something all women should abide by. Religious tradwives in the American context are typically Christian and use Bible verses to back up their practice of biblical marriage. For instance, Ephesians 5:22 through 24, which states, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is head of the wife, as also Christ is head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Amen." As for being anti-feminist, Christian women generally advocate for separate spheres in terms of gender roles in society, whereas conservative tradwives more generally view modern feminism as asserting the idea that women have to earn the same amount of money as men and take on male roles in order to be equally valued, whereas conservative tradwives are feminine, not feminist, and also agree with a more separate spheres kind of role for women. And then both camps typically oppose the technological progress of the sexual revolution that divorced women from their reproductive role in society. In opposition to neoliberalism, the present conservative current, at least in terms of espoused politics, is protectionist economics, which serves as a backdrop to beliefs on immigration, nationalism, abortion, and birth rates.
Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families. We must protect our borders from the ravages of other countries making our products, stealing our companies, and destroying our jobs. Protection will lead to great prosperity and strength.
In terms of immigration, there's the fear that increased immigration will lower American wages as well as collective bargaining. Back in the 1800s, labor unions advocated against immigration, viewing them as strikebreakers and that they'll bring down collective wages. But the problem at that time was that there was so much industrialization happening that there was such a need for labor that American birth rates just couldn't cover it. You had to bring in immigrants. And given the conservative outcry on declining national birth rates today, it makes sense that Tradwives, under the backdrop of nationalism, push back against contraceptives and abortions in order to raise the American population and labor force through means other than the neoliberal solution of offshoring and immigration. The belief that opposing immigration and the offshoring of labor will increase domestic wages also makes it more likely for families to subsist on a single income due to collective bargaining, and in the event of death or divorce, if a tradwife has to enter the market, without all these nannies and immigrants who will do the work for very little, it's more likely that they'll be able to be paid more for that work. And to be fair, I don't think most conservative tradwives are aware of this ideological backdrop of their movement. I don't think that's why they do what they do. I think they just generally believe in Judeo-Christian values. They don't want their kids raised by bureaucracies, etc. But you can see how these political policies do fall into the increase in protectionism and nationalism that we see on the right. And I do think that that tension is why the tradwife is kind of a perfect conglomeration of people's disdain for right-wing politics. But before we get into the extreme view of these politics, which is veering into the alt-right, I do want to bring up the opposite of Get to Work, a manifesto for working women or whatever, that's more fit to the tradwife ideology, and that is Domestic Extremist, a practical guide to winning the culture war, where the author advocates for women to birth as many children as possible, be stay-at-home moms, and hold traditional conservative values to defeat the tide of progressivism washing over our nation. She also argues for most of the book against abortion, birth control, IVF even, donating your eggs, surrogacy. She's Catholic, or as we call it today, tradcath, meaning she only believes in family planning, which is like the Catholic idea of letting your guy, come inside of you, but only when you're not ovulating. But otherwise, you gotta let God do his thing. And like many tradwife influencers, while she advocates being a stay-at-home mom and argues against the idea of women needing to work, she herself is not purely a stay-at-home mom. She's an author and a political figure. She's also gone back and forth to a corporate job in between raising children, because again, these people are influencers, okay? They are selling you a product. And as with Get to Work, my issue is not the way people choose to live their lives or what they believe. It's them pushing their beliefs on other people. Literally just leave women alone. 2024, leave women alone. To me, it just screams projection and insecurity, and it makes me feel like people's beliefs are just built on a stack of cards. I don't know. I'm obviously a live and let live kind of person, so. I also think through a reactionary lens that it's interesting that while industrialization brought agrarian communities into the cities, deindustrialization has brought a push to move families back to the suburbs where large families can be reared more easily. But now that we see the basic tenets of right-wing tradwifery, let's go into the extreme all the way to alt-right and ethno-nationalist tradwives or views of homemaking. So when I first started researching this topic, I naturally assumed that all of these articles about how tradwives are a part of the alt-right, I assumed it was all hyperbolic fear-mongering like we see all over politics, especially online. And to be fair, most of it is. But there is some truth to it in the sense that in the alt-right communities, there is an emphasis on tradwifery and being the perfect housewife. And while this trend is appropriated into the mainstream now, where it really just refers to any stay-at-home moms, there is still an alt-right strain to it, and that's what I'm going to be talking about here. For instance, in 2015, before the tradwife term really gained popularity, there was a Mormon influencer called Ayla Stewart, who appeared on white nationalist Lana Lochtiff's Radio 314 in an episode called Trad Women versus the Feminist Lifestyle, where the women talked about how there won't be a white race in a few years and white women need to have more babies, and Europe's going to be a nation of mud huts and sticks because the white race won't be around to create life-saving technologies like how they invented penicillin, and other topics of that sort. And while these channels were banned from YouTube at the height of their popularity, you can find the archived versions pretty easily online, meaning I had to spend a decent amount of time watching a bunch of white nationalist podcasts in order to fact check the things I say in this video. Don't ever say I never do anything for you guys, okay? I lost my IQ analyzing the JQ. That's how I spent my weekend. And then in 2017, Ayla issued a white baby challenge saying,
"Issuing a white baby challenge, I've made 6, match or beat me."
Which after facing backlash claims was a joke, which is why I had to go back and look at all these podcasts to see if those are her actual beliefs. And yeah, I don't know if she was joking in that one post, but it's definitely It's definitely her beliefs. And then there are other episodes of Lana Locktuff's show titled things like Is a Traditional Housewife the Ideal Woman? From before 2020 as well. And by 2018, the term tradwife began to pick up more as media attention swirled around the women of the alt-right. And to briefly explain what the alt-right is, it's a mostly online movement that is sometimes white nationalist in nature. It opposes multiculturalism and generally serves as a far-right kind of accelerationist ideology. It's by definition not mainstream conservatism. And then of course white nationalism is nationalism based on race. It's an identity politic movement. The most extreme form of this obviously is Nazi Germany. But as for the Tradwives, in 2018, the New York Times picked up on the nationalist strain of them in an opinion piece titled The Housewives of White Supremacy, which explains the backdrop of the movement, saying, "A frustrated yearning for a mythic past of material abundance at a time when it is becoming increasingly difficult for young people to build careers and achieve financial security is not gender specific. Young people face ever more obstacles, higher demands, and continually dwindling returns in the form of work benefits, job security, and pay. We shouldn't underestimate how some young white women, when faced with this bleak economic landscape and then presented with a rosy image of 1950s domestic bliss, may look back to 1960s Freudian-era feminism as having cheated them out of a family and a luxurious lifestyle, all supported by a single income. The men on the alt-right might point to diversity initiatives and mass immigration as having dismantled their career prospects. The women are furious that they have to consider career prospects at all." And this, of course, highlights my argument on the left and right split from neoliberalism, which is generally an ideology that promotes mass globalization and is seen to deny the sovereign right of nations to form their own identities. And while within mainstream conservatism, there's a constant tension between free market capitalism and more protectionist measures, the alt-right just kind of goes full force into hyper-nationalism and even fascism as a way of governing states. And while it's obviously a tiny minority of tradwives that are connected to the alt-right, I do think it's worth mentioning that in the United States, most stay-at-home moms are not white. Asian and Hispanic children are the most likely to be raised by stay-at-home mothers. 37% and 36% respectively were in 2012. That compares with 26% of white children and 23% of black children. And of course, there are non-white tradwife influencers as well, but I guess the majority of the ones on TikTok are white, which makes people think it's a white thing. I don't know. But to get into the most famous example of ethno-nationalism, let's take a look at stay-at-home moms under Nazi Germany. And under Hitler, the general economic goal of Nazi Germany was to be an autarky, which is a fully economically self-sufficient state. In reality, this kind of economy is really hard to achieve. Even the most infamous isolationist country of North Korea has to engage in trade with other countries and had to import food during widespread famine. But in terms of protectionist economics, the Nazi state supplied marriage loans and family income supplements for new children and gave a cross of honor to women who bore 4 or more babies. They also increased punishments for abortion. And fun fact, France still awards one of those kinds of medals, and Putin recently brought back the Soviet Union's Mother Heroine Award for those raising 10 or more children. And of course, this is not because these governments are so feminist and love tradwives and all of that. They love women. They're trying to get more foot soldiers for war, okay? And that's one way to incentivize raising the national birth rate. And like many countries in war, women in Nazi Germany did have to aid in the war effort through compulsory labor service in war-related industries, again showing how the tradwife lifestyle is fully dependent on technology, the economy, your government, and whether or not you're in war or peacetime. But if I'm going to highlight mothers in Nazi Germany as the far-right extreme, I obviously have to do the same when it comes to the far left, which is communism. So a brief aside on communism, motherhood, and why progressives don't embrace tradwives. Now, an outside observer coming to planet Earth might rationally come to the conclusion that given the atrocities of the 20th century, people would realize that maybe the ideologies of Nazism as well as Marxism are maybe like not the best. Maybe they're not like the best ideas. But no, everyone wants to be a dictator, so the fight rages on. And so it's become a lot more socially acceptable for the left online who form themselves in opposition to the alt-right of yesteryear to proudly proclaim themselves to be Marxist-Leninists or communists or even Maoist. It's like not even taboo anymore. And while some of the progressive wing embrace the dropping out, I don't dream of labor, I'm not gonna work movement of 2020, a larger faction of progressivism continues to advocate for increased protectionist economics, not through a middle ground of social democracy, but through straight up communism. And while communist thinkers vary in their beliefs on the family, Marx and Engels generally saw the nuclear family, especially the bourgeois nuclear family, as a source of private property and the division of labor, which is a source of oppression. And with the family reproducing this oppression, it needs to be mediated through technology and politics, so that way genders can be equal. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels also suggest the abolition of inheritance, weakening parent-child ties, and reducing the economic role of the family unit. And both Marx and Engels propose replacing home education with social education, and there have been socialist movements in the past advocating for paid domestic work and communal childcare and all of this kind of thing. Bernie Sanders advocated for a universal daycare, for instance. I do think if the progressive left was a little bit more interested in motherhood and like mother's experience, they would kind of try to figure out workable solutions to like many of these issues that I'm bringing up in this video. But when it comes to the extreme form of state-run communism, in 1974, the New York Times published an article called "In Soviet Union, Daycare is the Norm," which explains how babies are put into state-run daycares so mothers can continue working. And while many mothers preferred this setup, it's also important to note that due to the economy, it was very hard, if not impossible, to support a family on one income. Quote, "The vast majority of Soviet families require the salary of a working wife to make ends meet. Repeatedly, Soviet citizens expressed astonishment when they learned that an American father can support a family of 2, 3, or 4 children without his wife's working. Many are also surprised that American women would willingly have more than one child. That is suicide," said one 40-year-old mother. "Even with a preschool group for our daughter, we have a hard time coping." And in terms of criticism of the system, another mother of a 7-year-old girl said she had found a privately run playgroup, which was technically semi-illegal, for her daughter because she felt the upbringers in the state institutions were poorly qualified. "Their salary levels are among the lowest in the Soviet Union," she complained. Another mother, with 3 children, said she objected to extensive indoctrination in state nurseries and kindergartens with their songs about the motherland, Lenin, and border guards on watch against hostile foreigners. Still others said they disliked having children raised so much of the time by people outside the family during the early formative years. And overall, there were very few housewives in communist countries until economic reform in the 1990s, which allowed for it to look a little bit more like America, post-World War II America. And while Marxist ideology definitely played a role in the setup of this kind of system, I do once again think it's economic possibilities that drive women to either work or stay at home. When there is more freedom and choice to stay at home, more women will do it. But if you have to have, income and labor, then that's what you're going to be doing. In a society that pushes for total equality, though, both sexes have to work. Gender is basically abolished. Gender differences and roles will be mitigated as much as possible through technology, so that way everybody is the same. And that's why I think the tradwife trend is hyper-scrutinized both from a feminist perspective as well as a progressive one, because it really does go against people's notions of equality as well as, patriarchy and sexism and oppression and all of that. But to conclude, social media is obviously about extremes. Most people are not going to be fully a tradwife or fully like a dual income feminist. Most people are not alt-right or straight up communist. Most people are just in the middle of a lot of things, and tradwife discourse is just one way to highlight what's going on in our country. With that being said, I hope you maybe learned something from this video, found it entertaining. I don't know. Let me know what you think down below. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.